She paid $350 for silence. The church had waited 30 years to speak. Beneath the altar, stone steps, carved names, buried truth. Would you have opened what she was never meant to find? The auction paper felt thin in Maren Coleridge's hand, like proof of something that shouldn't exist. $350. As is. No refunds. She stood before the abandoned church in Ash Vale, October light slanting through broken stained glass, throwing fractured reds and blues across rotted pews. The colors moved like they were breathing. The building itself looked like it had been holding its breath for decades, gray stone softened by moss. Wooden doors warped and split, windows that no longer kept anything out or in. Maren folded the paper and slipped it into her coat pocket. The air smelled like damp wood and something sweeter underneath. Old incense, maybe, or the ghost of candle wax. She stepped through the doorway. The floor groaned beneath her weight, warped boards protesting after years of silence. Inside, the silence wasn't empty. It was the kind that pressed against your eardrums, made you aware of your own pulse. Her footsteps echoed too loud, each one announcing her presence to something she couldn't see. Dust hung in the light, like slow-motion snow. The pews were splintered. Some collapsed entirely, others leaning like they'd given up halfway through falling. But the altar was still standing. She stopped halfway down the aisle, her breath visible in the cold. $350. That's what this place was worth. Less than a used car. Less than a month's rent in the city she'd left behind. Less than the cost of a funeral. 6 months ago, Maren's apartment had walls the color of eggshells and carpets that swallowed sound. Calla's bedroom door stayed closed. Maren didn't open it, didn't go in, just stood outside sometimes, hand on the doorknob, waiting for something that never came. Permission, maybe, or the courage to let go. Iris had visited on a Tuesday, brought coffee that went cold, sat on the couch and didn't ask the questions she wanted to ask, until finally she did. "Are you running away?" Iris said quietly. "Or running towards something?" Maren hadn't looked at her, just kept staring at Calla's door, that white painted surface that might as well have been a tombstone. "Does it matter?" Iris didn't answer. There wasn't an answer, not one that made grief smaller or time move faster, or the apartment feel less like a waiting room for a life that had already left. Maren blinked. The memory dissolved. She was back in the church, standing in cold October air that smelled like rot and forgiveness. She walked toward the altar, her steps slower now, deliberate. The wood was carved, intricate, vines and leaves curling across its surface, worn smooth in places where hands had touched it, rough everywhere else. Decades of dust blurred the details, but she could still see the craftsmanship underneath. Someone had cared about this once, built it to last, built it like it meant something. She reached out, and fingers hovering just above the surface. Something about this place felt like it had been waiting, not for anyone, for her. Her hand touched the wood, cold, solid, real. A draft hit her from the left, sharp, biting, coming from nowhere. She turned. The windows were broken, but the air had been still a moment ago. Now it moved like something exhaled. Her eyes caught on a detail she'd missed before. A single candle holder on the altar. Brass, tarnished, sitting slightly off-center. Sevi, like someone had moved it. Recently. But that wasn't possible. The church had been abandoned for decades. The auction listing said so. No one had been inside since. She saw the door, to the right of the altar, set into the stone wall, half hidden in shadow. Wooden. Old. Slightly ajar. Maren's chest tightened. She'd walked the length of the aisle. She'd looked at every corner, every broken window, every collapsed pew. She would have noticed a door, wouldn't she? The draft came again, colder this time, pulling toward the door like an invitation. Or a breath drawing inward. She stepped closer. The wood was dark, almost black with age. Iron hinges rusted, but still intact. The gap was maybe 6 inches wide, just enough to see that it led down. Stone steps, steep and narrow, disappearing into darkness that felt older than the building itself. Maren stood there, one hand still resting on the altar, the other reaching toward the door she hadn't seen. The cold air smelled like stone, like earth, like something buried. She pulled her hand back. Not yet. But the door stayed open, waiting, just like everything else in this place. 2 weeks in, Maren had learned the rhythm of the church. Morning light came in, cold and fractured. She swept dust that had been settling for decades, watched it rise in clouds that caught the broken colors from the stained glass. Reds that looked like dried blood, blues like winter water. The work was meditative, repetitive. She stripped the rotted pews one by one, stacked the salvageable wood near the entrance, piled the rest outside for burning later. She didn't speak. There was no one to speak to. The silence didn't bother her anymore. It felt like company, the kind that didn't ask questions or expect answers or try to fix things that couldn't be fixed. She patched windows with plywood and duct tape, temporary repairs that let in less wind but kept the shadows. The church still felt like something half open, a door that wouldn't close all the way. She told herself that was fine. She wasn't trying to seal anything out. She was just trying to breathe. Asheville watched her the way small towns watch strangers. From across the street, through storefront windows, over the edges of newspapers held too long at the same page. People didn't approach. They crossed to the other side when they passed the church. Some looked away entirely, like the building itself was something indecent. One morning, an elderly woman in a long gray coat walked by. Maren was outside, pulling broken boards from the church's side entrance. The woman slowed, stopped, stared. Then she crossed herself. Quick, deliberate, like warding off something unholy. Maren froze, wood planks still in her hands, splinters pressing into her palms. The woman didn't speak, just turned and kept walking, her steps faster now, as if staying too long might invite something in. Maren set the board down slowly, looked back at the church, stone and wood and shattered glass. A building, nothing more. But the woman's gesture stayed with her, the way fear looked when it was old, inherited. Iris arrived on a Thursday with 2 paper cups of coffee and skepticism written across her face. "You're actually doing this," Iris said, stepping through the front doors, eyes scanning the half-cleared interior. Dust motes swirled around her like tiny warnings. "Doing what?" Maren said, not looking up from the pew she was sanding. "Living in a church." "I'm not living here. You're here 14 hours a day, Maren. That's living." Maren kept sanding. The repetitive motion, the sound of wood against paper, it kept her hands busy, kept her thoughts from spiraling. Iris set the coffees down on the altar. Maren watched her do it, felt something tighten in her chest. That was sacred space once, or supposed to be. Now it was just a flat surface for lukewarm coffee. "You can't keep doing this," Iris said, softer now. "Hiding." "I'm not hiding." "Then what are you doing?" But Maren paused, set the sandpaper down, looked at Iris, really looked at her, the worry in her eyes, the exhaustion around the edges, the friend who'd stayed when everyone else got tired of grief that didn't have an expiration date. "You can't live in a church, Maren." Maren almost smiled. "Why not? It's already full of ghosts." Iris didn't laugh. She just looked sad, like she'd already lost an argument she hadn't started yet. She left 20 minutes later. The coffee stayed on the altar, going cold. The discoveries came in small ways, like the church was revealing itself one secret at a time. A child's drawing, tucked behind a pew near the back. Faded, yellowed with age, the paper brittle when Marin unfolded it. Crayon lines, simple and deliberate. A girl in a white dress, standing in front of something tall and dark. A building, maybe, or a door. The girl had no face, just an empty oval where features should have been. Marin turned the drawing over. No name, no date. Just the image, preserved by accident in the gap between wood and stone. She set it on the altar next to the cold coffee, looked at it longer than she should have. The confessional booth was near the front, half collapsed but still standing. Marin hadn't gone inside yet. Didn't need to. But that afternoon the door creaked open on its own, just a few inches, enough to let in light. She stepped closer, looked inside. The wood was scratched. Deep gouges, running vertically down the interior walls, clustered near where someone would sit. Fingernails, maybe, or something sharper. The scratches were deliberate, frantic, like someone had been trying to claw their way out. Marin's stomach turned. She backed away, letting the door swing shut. That night she tried to move the altar. She didn't know why. It just felt wrong where it was, off-center, too far from the back wall, like it had been shifted at some point and never corrected. She braced her shoulder against it, pushed. It didn't move. She pushed harder, dug her heels in, used her full weight. Nothing. Like it was bolted to the floor, rooted. She stepped back, breathing hard, staring at the wood that shouldn't be this heavy. Shouldn't be this immovable. Her eyes drifted to the half-open door beside it, the one leading down. She still hadn't gone through it. Late that night, alone in the church with only the fractured moonlight for company, Marin heard it. A sound beneath the floorboards, near the altar, soft at first, rhythmic, a hollow echo, like something shifting in a space that shouldn't exist. She froze, listened. It came again, steady, measured, like breathing. By the third week, the church had become a map of questions. Marin stopped pretending the sound wasn't there. Late at night, when the wind died and the town went silent, she could hear it. That hollow rhythm beneath the floorboards near the altar. Not constant, not loud, just present. Like the building had a pulse she'd finally learned to listen for. She knelt beside the altar, ran her hands along the edges where wood met stone. The floorboards here were older, darker, fitted tighter than the rest. She pressed her palm flat against them, felt the cold seep through, waited. The sound came again, a soft echo, deep and distant, like something shifting in a space that shouldn't exist. She grabbed the crowbar she'd been using to strip pews, wedged it between the boards, pulled. The wood resisted, then splintered. Decades of dust rose in a cloud that tasted like decay and old smoke. She coughed, kept pulling. One board, then another. The gap widened. Beneath the floor, stone steps, narrow, steep, leading down into darkness that felt older than the church itself. Marin sat back on her heels, breathing hard, staring. The door she'd seen in section 1, the half-open one beside the altar, hadn't been a door at all. It had been a distraction, a misdirection. The real entrance had been under her feet the whole time. She descended slowly, phone flashlight cutting a thin beam through blackness. The air grew colder with each step, damp and heavy, clinging to her skin like something living. The stone walls were slick with moisture, centuries-old mortar crumbling between the blocks. Her breath came out in visible clouds. She counted steps. 12, 15, 20. The staircase ended at a landing. Ahead, an iron door, rusted but intact, hinges thick as her wrist. Above, it carved into the stone lintel in letters deep enough to catch shadow. Silentium. Silence. Marin's hand hovered over the door handle. Cold metal, rough with corrosion. She hesitated. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was trespassing on something deliberately hidden. She pushed. The door groaned open, metal scraping stone, the sound sharp enough to make her flinch. Inside, a small underground chapel, untouched, perfectly preserved, like someone had sealed it and walked away decades ago, leaving everything exactly as it was. Rows of wooden benches faced a stone wall. No windows. No altar here, just the wall itself, rough-hewn and unadorned. A single candle holder sat on a small ledge, wax long since melted into a frozen drip. The air smelled like earth and something faintly chemical. Rust, maybe, or old blood. Marin stepped inside. Her flashlight swept across the benches, simple, worn edges smooth from use. She moved closer to the wall and saw the names. Dozens of them, carved into the stone with desperate, uneven strokes. Some deep, some barely scratches. Women's names, dates, years spanning the 1920s to the 1960s. Margaret Thorne, 1923. Eliza Voss, 1931. Beatrice Hale, 1947. Marin's flashlight moved down the wall. More names, more dates. Each one a person. Each one a woman who'd been here, in this buried room, carving her existence into stone like proof she'd lived. Her light stopped. Calla Renwick, 1958. Marin's chest tightened. Her breath caught. Not her sister. Couldn't be. Her sister had been born in 1996, died in 2024. This was someone else. A different Calla. A coincidence. But the name sat there on the wall like an accusation. Like the church had been waiting for her all along. Like it had known. She reached out, traced the letters with her fingertips. The stone was cold. The carving was shallow, hurried. The letters uneven. Whoever Calla Renwick had been in 1958, she'd carved her name here quickly, desperately, like she was running out of time. Marin turned, scanning the rest of the chapel. Her light caught on something near the back, a small stone ledge carved into the wall like a makeshift altar. And on it, a leather journal. She crossed the space in 3 steps, picked it up carefully. The leather was cracked, brittle, corners worn soft with age. She opened it. The pages were filled with handwriting, different hands, different inks. Some entries barely legible, others careful and deliberate. Dates in the margins, initials at the bottom of each page. Marin flipped through, slowly. Words jumped out at her. They say silence is holy. Father Thorne came again today. I don't know how much longer. Mama sent me here to be forgiven. The handwriting blurred. Marin blinked, realized her hands were shaking. This wasn't a chapel. It was a prison. And every woman who'd been locked down here had left pieces of herself behind, carved into stone, written into pages, hidden in the dark where no one would find them. Until now. Marin closed the journal carefully, held it against her chest, looked back at the wall of names. Calla Renwick stared back at her from 1958, silent and waiting. I see you, Marin whispered. The words echoed in the small stone room, soft, inadequate. But it was the only thing she could think to say. She turned and climbed the stairs, journal clutched tight, leaving the door open behind her. The names stayed carved in the dark, but they weren't alone anymore. Someone had finally come looking. That night, she didn't sleep. She read. The journal sat open on the altar upstairs, pages brittle beneath the fractured light from the stained glass. Marin's hands moved carefully. turning each leaf like it might crumble under too much pressure. The handwriting changed every few pages. Different hands, different inks, some careful and looping, others jagged and desperate. But the stories were the same. Mama says I'm being sent for correction. Father Thorn says silence will make me pure again. 3 weeks in the dark, I've lost count of the days. He tells us we're being saved, but salvation shouldn't feel like suffocation. Young women, sent by their families for transgressions Maren could only guess at. Pregnancy out of wedlock, defiance, love deemed inappropriate, locked in the underground chapel for weeks, sometimes months. Overseen by Father Oswin Thorn, whose sermons about purity were cover for something far darker. Punishment disguised as redemption. Silence enforced as repentance. Maren's throat tightened. She kept reading. The entry dated October 12, 1958 was shorter than the others. The handwriting, smaller, pressed hard into the page like the writer was running out of time. Or hope. He says silence is repentance, but I think silence is just another word for disappearing. At the bottom, 2 initials, C.R. Calla Renwick. Maren stared at the letters until they blurred. She blinked, read it again. The words didn't change. Silence is just another word for disappearing. Her sister's name, a different woman, a different century, but the same truth. Grief wasn't just absence. It was erasure. The quiet that happened when someone's voice stopped mattering, when their story stopped being told. Maren closed the journal, pressed her palms flat against the cover, felt the weight of all those women who'd carved their names into stone because no one else would remember them. She wouldn't let them disappear again. By dawn, she'd cross-referenced everything she could find online. Town records, census data, obituaries, church archives scanned and uploaded by historical societies that didn't know what they were preserving. Father Oswin Thorn died 1965, age 73. Cause of death listed as natural. No scandal, no investigation. The church closed 6 months later, cited as structurally unsound in municipal records. No mention of the underground chapel, no mention of the women, just closure, quiet and complete. The women's names were harder to trace. Most had left Ashevale after their time in the church, if they left at all. A few appeared in later census records, married, relocated, names changed. Others vanished entirely from public documentation after the dates carved into the wall. Maren made a list. Cross-checked birth and death records. Found obituaries for 12 of the women. Most died young, 30s, 40s, 50s. Causes rarely specified. Just dates and towns and the briefest acknowledgments that they'd existed at all. She printed everything, spread the pages across the altar like evidence in a trial that never happened. This wasn't history. It was a cover-up. Iris returned that afternoon, let herself in without knocking, like she always did. She found Maren surrounded by papers, eyes red-rimmed, the journal open between them. Maren, read it! Iris hesitated, then picked up the journal, flipped through slowly. Her face changed, hardened, then crumpled, then went very still. She set it down carefully, like it might break or explode. You can't fix this, Maren. I know. This happened decades ago. These women most of them are gone. You can't bring them back. You can't. Iris's voice cracked. Is not your grief to carry. Maren looked at her, really looked, saw the fear underneath the practicality, the worry that Maren was disappearing into this the same way she disappeared into Calla's death, letting someone else's tragedy consume her because it was easier than facing her own. Maybe she was right, but that didn't make it less real. Then whose is it? Maren asked quietly. Iris didn't answer. There wasn't an answer. Grief didn't belong to anyone. It just existed, unclaimed, waiting for someone to acknowledge it. Iris left 20 minutes later. Didn't say goodbye. Just looked back once from the doorway, like she was already mourning something she couldn't name. Maren descended the stone stairs alone. The underground chapel felt different now. Not haunted, witnessed. She stood in front of the wall of names, journal still clutched in her hand. Ran her eyes over each carved letter, each desperate stroke. These women had tried so hard to be remembered, had believed, even in the dark, that someone might eventually come looking, and no one had. For 60 years, this room had been sealed, forgotten, buried beneath a church that claimed to offer sanctuary while building prisons in its basement. Maren's hand traced Calla Renwick's name again. 1958. Silence is just another word for disappearing. She looked around the small stone room, the benches where women had sat for weeks, the walls that had held their voices, the single candle holder that had provided the only light. This place was a tomb before it was ever a sanctuary, and she was standing in it. Finally, sheep-bearing, witness to what had been hidden. "I won't let you disappear," Maren whispered to the names. To all of them. To Calla Renwick, 1958, and the others who'd been silenced and erased. To her sister, whose name she still couldn't say aloud without breaking. The words echoed softly, honest, incomplete, but it was a start. The next 3 weeks were archaeological. Maren stopped sleeping in a bed, started sleeping on the floor of the church, wrapped in blankets that smelled like dust and cold stone. She worked by lamplight, papers spread across every surface. Obituaries, census records, marriage certificates, death notices. Each name on the wall became a person. Each person became a trail she could follow. Margaret Thorne, 1923, dead at 34, cause not listed. Eliza Voss, 1931, disappeared from public record after age 22. No marriage, no death certificate, just absence. Beatrice Hale, 1947, died at 41 in a town 3 states away. Obituary mentioned no family, no children, just a quiet funeral and a grave no one visited. Most died young. Some vanished entirely. A few lived long lives, but left Ashevale immediately after their time in the church, and never returned. Their stories ended in other towns, under other names, as if the women they'd been before had been buried in that underground chapel and never dug back up. Maren's hands shook as she wrote. Her eyes burned. She couldn't stop. She found Beatrice Renwick through a genealogy website. Granddaughter of Calla Renwick, 1958. Still alive, 87 years old, living 2 hours north in a senior community. Maren called, left a message, didn't expect a response. 3 days later, her phone rang. "You're the woman who bought the church," Beatrice said. Her voice was thin, careful, like she was testing the weight of each word before speaking it. "Yes." Silence. Long enough that Maren thought she'd hung up. Then, "What did you find?" Maren told her. The underground chapel, the names on the wall, the journal, her grandmother's entry. More silence, longer this time. Maren could hear breathing on the other end, shallow, uneven. "My grandmother never spoke about what happened there." Beatrice's voice cracked. "She left Ashevale at 19, and never came back. Not once, not even for funerals. She had nightmares until the day she died. Used to wake up screaming about walls closing in, about being locked in the dark." Maren closed her eyes, pressed the phone harder against her ear. "She carved her name into the stone," Maren said quietly, "so someone would know she'd been there." Beatrice made a sound, half sob, half exhale. "Thank you for telling me. I always wondered." She wouldn't say, couldn't say, but I knew something had broken her before I ever knew her. They talked for 20 more minutes. Beatrice shared fragments. Her grandmother's fear of churches, of closed doors, of silence that lasted too long, small griefs that had echoed down through generations, shaping lives that came after, without anyone knowing why. When they hung up, Maren sat in the empty church and wept. Not for her sister, not this time. For Calla Renwick, 1958, who'd carved her name into stone and lived another 60 years, haunted by what happened in a room no one acknowledged existed. Maren returned to the underground chapel that night, stood among the names, journal open in her hands. Her grief for her sister Calla had led her here. But it wasn't coincidence. It was echo. She'd been carrying the weight of women who were never allowed to grieve for themselves, who'd been told their pain didn't matter. That silence was virtue. That disappearing was the price of redemption. Her sister had died in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that couldn't save her. But the silence that followed, the way people stopped saying Calla's name, stopped asking how Maren was doing, stopped acknowledging the shape of the absence. That was the same erasure these women had faced. Different century, same truth. Grief only grows in silence. And silence is just another word for forgetting. Maren looked at the names carved into stone, ran her fingers over the rough edges. If you've ever felt the weight of silence, yours or someone else's, you know what I'm trying to do here. She whispered to the empty room, to the walls, to herself. The words hung in the cold air, soft, true. She wasn't doing this for her sister anymore. She was doing it for all of them. For every woman who'd been told her voice didn't matter. For every story that had been buried because it was inconvenient or shameful or too painful to hear. She was doing it because someone had to. Iris came back 2 days later, found Maren in the underground chapel, surrounded by printed records, highlighter marks bleeding through thin paper. "You look like hell," Iris said. "Probably. When's the last time you ate?" Maren didn't answer, couldn't remember. Iris sat down on one of the wooden benches, looked at the wall of names. Her face went very still. "You're not an investigator, Maren," she said quietly. "You're a woman who bought a broken building to avoid her own life." Maren looked at her, saw the fear there, the love underneath it. "Maybe," Maren said. "But at least I'm not silent." Iris opened her mouth, closed it, shook her head. "You're going to get hurt doing this." "I'm already hurt." "That's not what I mean." Maren knew what she meant. The town wouldn't like this. The families wouldn't like this. People who'd spent decades pretending this place didn't exist wouldn't appreciate someone forcing them to remember. But that didn't make it less true. "I know," Maren said. Iris stood, walked to the wall, touched one of the names gently, like it might bruise. "What are you going to do?" Maren looked at the journal in her hands. The names on the wall, the cold stone room that had held so many women's voices. "I'm going to make sure they're not forgotten." Iris nodded slowly, didn't argue, just stood there with her. Two women in a tomb that refused to stay buried. By late autumn, the town had noticed. The bronze plaque arrived on a Tuesday. Maren installed it herself, drilling into the stone beside the church's front entrance, hands steady despite the cold. The metal was heavy, engraved with 37 names in careful letters. At the bottom, a single line, silenced, not forgotten, 19/2019, 65. She stepped back, looked at it in the gray October light. The names caught the shadows, made each letter feel carved rather than printed. Permanent, undeniable, People walked past slowly that first day, stopped, read. Some crossed the street immediately after, eyes down, shoulders tight. Others stood longer, lips moving as they traced the names. One woman touched the plaque gently, fingers hovering over a name near the top, then walked away quickly, wiping her eyes. Mrs. Dallin came that afternoon. She stood in front of the plaque, gray coat pulled tight around her thin frame, face pale with something Marin couldn't name. Fury, shame, fear. "You're desecrating a holy place," Mrs. Dallin said. Her voice shook. Marin stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the cold, looked at the woman who'd crossed herself weeks ago, warding off something she'd never named. It stopped being holy the moment it became a prison. Mrs. Dallin flinched, like the words had struck her physically. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Marin's voice was quiet, steady. "You knew. Yeah, all of you knew." Mrs. Dallin opened her mouth, closed it. Her hands trembled where they gripped her coat. She turned and walked away without another word. But Marin saw the way her shoulders bent, the way she moved like something inside her had finally broken. The town meeting was called 3 days later, held in the community center, packed wall to wall with people who hadn't spoken to Marin once in the months she'd lived here. Now they came, angry, curious, afraid. Marin stood at the front, journal in her hands, printed records spread across the table beside her. Iris sat in the second row, arms folded, jaw tight. Beatrice Renwick sat beside her, quiet, very small, eyes fixed on Marin like she was the only solid thing in the room. The town council leader, a man in his 60s with a voice used to being obeyed, spoke first. "Ms. Coleridge, you've caused considerable distress in this community. We're here to discuss your installation and the claims you've been making about the church." Marin looked at him, then at the crowd, faces she'd seen from across the street, people who'd watched her work and never offered help, never asked questions. She opened the journal. "These are their words," she said. "Not mine." She read, slowly, deliberately, passages about locked doors and weeks in darkness, about Father Oswin Thorne, whose sermons praised purity while his actions punished women for being human, about families who sent their daughters away and never spoke of them again. The room grew quieter with each word. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at their hands. "Father Thorne," Marin said, looking up, "died peacefully in 1965. The church closed 6 months later. No investigation, no acknowledgement, just silence." She set the journal down, let the weight of it sit in the room. These women carved their names into stone because they believed someone would eventually care enough to look. It took 60 years. "But I'm looking now." A woman in the back stood abruptly. "This is slander. My grandfather knew Father Thorne. He was a good man. He locked women in a basement and called it salvation." The woman's face went red. She walked out. 3 others followed, but more stayed. An elderly man near the front spoke, voice cracking. "My aunt disappeared when she was 17. Family said she moved away, but I found letters in my mother's things after she died. Letters from the church, from 1952. He looked at Marin, eyes wet. "Was her name on that wall?" Marin checked her list. Found it. "Sarah Morton, February 1952. The man covered his face with his hands. Someone beside him, his wife maybe, reached over, held his arm. The room fractured. Some people wept. Some walked out, furious, unwilling to hear more. Others stayed, silent and shaking, realizing they'd inherited secrets they'd never known existed. Iris stood, walked to the front, stood beside Marin without speaking. Just presence. Solidarity. Beatrice Renwick stood next, moved slowly to the front, leaning on her cane, looked at the room with eyes that had seen too much. "My grandmother was Calla Renwick," she said quietly. "She never spoke about what happened in that church, but she screamed in her sleep for 40 years, and no one asked why." 3 more people stood, descendants of women whose names were carved in stone. They didn't speak, just stood. Witnesses. The council leader looked at Myron, at the people standing with her, at the fractured room. "This meeting is adjourned," he said quietly. People filed out in silence, some angry, some broken, some relieved that someone had finally said it aloud. Myron returned to the underground chapel alone that night. She stood in front of the wall of names, held the chisel she'd borrowed from the hardware store. Her hands were steady, but she found a bare space near the bottom, pressed the blade against the stone, carved slowly, carefully, one letter at a time. Calla Coleridge, 2024. Her sister's name, the grief that had led her here, the silence she'd been carrying for months. She stepped back, looked at the name beside all the others. "I speak for you now," she whispered. The words echoed softly in the stone room. True, incomplete, but finally spoken aloud. Myron set the chisel down, touched her sister's name one last time, then climbed the stairs, leaving the door open behind her. The names stayed carved in the dark, but they weren't alone anymore, and neither was she. Winter arrived quietly. The church felt different now, not emptier, just still, like something that had been holding its breath for decades had finally exhaled. Myron sat on one of the salvaged pews, hands folded in her lap, staring at the fractured stained glass. She'd left it broken, left the worn wood exposed, left the stone stairs visible, descending into the underground chapel that was no longer hidden. This place wasn't meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be true. The cold seeped through the walls, but she didn't move, just sat, breathed, felt the weight of everything that had happened settle into her bones. The plaque outside was permanent now. Bronze doesn't fade, doesn't forgive. The names would stay carved in stone and metal, visible to anyone who passed, whether they wanted to see them or not. She'd done what she came to do, but she didn't feel victorious. She felt hollowed out, like she'd spent weeks excavating not just the church, but herself, and now there was nothing left but raw edges and empty space. Maybe that was healing, or maybe it was just exhaustion. She wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. Iris came by on a Thursday, last visit, before leaving Ashvale for good. She stood in the doorway, backlit by winter sun, hands in her coat pockets. Looked around the church like she was memorizing it, or saying goodbye to something she couldn't name. "You staying?" Iris asked. "For now." Iris nodded, walked inside, sat beside Myron on the pew. They didn't speak for a while, just sat in the cold, quiet space. 2 women who'd known each other long enough to let silence be enough. "Was it worth it?" Iris finally asked. Soft, no judgment, just curiosity. Myron looked at the broken, stained glass, the light filtering through in fractured colors, reds and blues that never quite aligned but somehow still made something beautiful. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I couldn't leave them in the dark." Iris reached over, squeezed her hand once. "Let go. You're braver than I am." "I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being silent." Iris smiled, sad, proud. Same thing, maybe. She stood, walked to the door, paused. "Take care of yourself, Myron. Not just them." Then she was gone. Myron sat alone again, thought about what Iris had said. She hadn't come here to heal from Calla's death. She'd come here because she needed to believe grief could be transformed into something other than silence. That loss didn't have to mean erasure. that the dead could still speak if someone was willing to listen. She'd found that here, in the names carved into stone, in the journal filled with voices that refused to disappear, in the women who'd believed, even in the dark, that someone would eventually care enough to look. But she also realized something else. She hadn't saved them. She'd just witnessed them. And maybe that was all anyone could do. Hold space for the stories that had been buried, refuse to let silence be the final word. Her sister Kala was gone. Nothing would bring her back. But her name was carved into the wall now, among the others, part of a chorus of women who'd existed and mattered and deserved to be remembered. That wasn't closure, but it was something. She visited Beatrice Renwick the next day, drove 2 hours north with a piece of paper carefully folded in her coat pocket. Beatrice answered the door slowly, leaning on her cane, eyes brightening when she saw Maren. "Come in, dear. It's freezing out there." They sat in Beatrice's small living room, tea cooling on the coffee table between them. Maren pulled out the paper, unfolded it carefully, a rubbing. Charcoal pressed against thin paper, capturing the carved letters from the underground chapel wall. Kala Renwick, 1958. Beatrice stared at it, reached out with trembling fingers, touched the letters like they were sacred. "That's her name," she whispered. "That's really her name." "She carved it herself," Maren said, "so someone would know she'd been there." Beatrice pressed the paper to her chest, eyes wet, mouth trembling. "Thank you," she said, voice breaking. "Thank you for letting her be seen." Maren stayed for an hour. They talked about small things, Beatrice's garden, the weather, nothing important. But the rubbing sat on the table between them the whole time, proof that someone had finally looked. When Maren left, Beatrice was still holding it, like a relic, like proof that her grandmother's pain had mattered. Back in Ashvale, Maren stood outside the church as the sun set. The bronze plaque caught the last of the light, names glowing briefly before fading into shadow. She pulled the church doors closed, not to seal them, to protect them. A small wooden sign hung beside the entrance now, hand-carved, simple, open by appointment, a place for remembering. She locked the door with a key that felt heavier than it should, stood there for a moment, hands still on the wood, feeling the coal seep through her gloves. This place was a memorial now, not a sanctuary, not a prison, just a space where truth lived, visible and unburied, waiting for anyone brave enough to look. She turned, walked down the stone steps. The winter air bit her face, sharp and clean. Behind her the church stood silent, waiting, but not empty, never empty again. By spring the church had become what it was always meant to be, a question answered. Maren didn't live there anymore. She'd rented a small cottage 2 streets over, white walls and windows that let in light without breaking it into colors. But she returned twice a week, unlocked the heavy doors, let the air in, let people in when they asked. She led quiet tours for descendants who needed to see the names, for historians who wanted to document what had been hidden, for strangers who'd heard the story and needed to know it was real. She didn't charge, didn't explain too much, just opened the doors, pointed toward the stone stairs, and let people find their own way down. Some wept, some stood in silence, fingers tracing carved letters. Some left flowers on the benches in the underground chapel, small offerings to women they'd never met but somehow understood. Maren stayed upstairs, gave them space, let the names speak for themselves. One afternoon in April, a young woman arrived, mid-20s, dark hair pulled back, eyes red like she'd been crying before she even got there. She didn't say her name, just asked, "Can I go down?" Mara nodded, handed her a flashlight, watched her descend. 20 minutes later, the woman came back up, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, daisies and something purple Marin didn't recognize. She'd left them on the stone ledge below, the place where the journal used to sit. "Thank you," the woman whispered, voice raw. Mara nodded. Didn't ask which name belonged to her. Some grief didn't need an introduction. It just needed to be witnessed. The woman left. The flowers stayed. That night, Marin sat at the altar upstairs. The journal lay open in front of her. Pages filled with voices from women who'd refused to disappear. She pulled out a pen, wrote carefully on a blank page near the back, "Calla, I couldn't save you, but I learned how to let you speak through me. Maybe that's all love becomes after loss. An ear bent towards silence until it finally breaks. I don't know if you'd be proud of what I've done here, but I know you'd understand why I had to. You were never just my sister. You were proof that someone existed, that someone mattered. These women taught me that. They carved their names into stone because they believed remembering was an act of defiance. So I remember you. Not the way you died, the way you lived. That's enough. It has to be." She signed her name, closed the journal, placed it back on the altar where anyone who visited could read it. All the voices together, hers included. Marin stood, walked to the center of the church, looked up at the stained glass. She'd repaired some of it, patched the worst breaks, but she'd left the fractures, left the places where light came through wrong, splitting into colors that didn't quite align. Sunlight poured through now, late afternoon gold breaking into reds and blues, and something close to violet. The colors fell across the stone floor, across the altar, across her hands where they rested at her sides. Not perfect, but luminous. She thought about the women who'd been locked in the dark, who'd carved their names by candlelight or memory or sheer, desperate hope. Who'd believed that someday someone would see. She thought about her sister, about the silence that had followed her death, about the months Marin had spent avoiding Calla's name. Her room, her memory, like forgetting might hurt less than remembering. But it didn't. Silence had never been the answer. It had just been the easier question. She exhaled, felt something release in her chest. Not closure, not healing, just space, room to breathe without the weight of all that unspoken grief pressing down. The light shifted. The colors moved across the stone. Marin stood still, let it touch her, let herself be seen. Outside, the bronze plaque caught the spring sun. 37 names, one line beneath them. Silenced, not forgotten. 19/20/19, 65. People walked by. Some stopped, read, kept walking. Others stayed longer, touched the metal, left flowers by the door. The church stood quiet. Doors unlocked, waiting. A place for remembering. A place where brokenness wasn't something to hide. Where voices carved into stone still spoke. Where silence finally broke. She thought restoration meant erasing cracks. But some buildings, and some hearts, are stronger for the places they broke. Silence was never the answer. It was just the question we were too afraid to ask. And maybe the bravest thing we can do is stop fixing what's broken and start letting it be seen.